Circular reasoning is the fallacy of arguing for a conclusion using an argument that already presupposes that conclusion. Premise 1. A if and only if B. Premise 2. A. Conclusion, therefore B. Nothing wrong with this, right? Well, how about now? The problem is that premise 2 is supported by B, which is the conclusion we're trying to reach. We find ourselves able to rewrite this argument A because B, B because A. Nowhere in an argument for B are we allowed to assume that B is true. A premise that relies on B being true can never be used when arguing for B, because we'd be assuming the truth of the very thing we're trying to prove. The most obvious form of this fallacy is called begging the question. This is when the argument contains a premise that is identical to, or at least synonymous with, the conclusion. For example, the reason why this movie is R-rated is that it has been deemed unsuitable for children. Yes, that's what an R rating means. It's not an explanation of why the movie ended up getting that rating. Why is it unsuitable for children? Oh, wait, let me guess. Because it's R-rated, right? When challenged to support their beliefs without relying on faith, religious people often cite their holy books as proof of the truth of their religion. This is the infallible word of God. I know this because it says so, and it must be true because it's the word of God. It's hard to find a more obvious example of circular reasoning, but I think I know where to look. When arguing against the claim that anecdotal evidence is worthless, Winston Wu says, and no, I'm not kidding, quote, "While it may be true that most of the paranormal evidence is largely anecdotal in nature, by no means is it true that they are worthless or invalid," unquote. So, anecdotal evidence isn't worthless because it's not worthless. This is an actual point brought up to explain what's wrong with rejecting anecdotal evidence as worthless. It's not worthless, therefore it's not worthless. The reason I want to use authentic examples in these videos is that when you look up fallacies, the examples given are so ridiculously obvious. No one would ever present an argument that obviously fallacious. Question begging is almost always disguised by at least rephrasing the premise. Well, except when Winston Wu is involved, apparently. Wu also uses another form of circular reasoning that can be presented as follows. Premise 1. If A were false, I would not believe A. This is usually a hidden premise. Premise 2. I believe A. Conclusion, therefore A. This is called the argument from self-knowing. There are a couple of things wrong with it. Obviously, premise 1 can be rejected because we know it's possible to believe things that are false, but even if we granted the premise, we'd have to ask why the person believes A, and that's when it gets circular. Obviously, if you didn't accept the conclusion A to begin with, you wouldn't believe A. That's what it means to believe something, to accept it as true. Thus, if we granted premise 1, and we absolutely shouldn't, the argument could be rewritten: A is true because I believe A, and I believe A because A is true. That's obviously circular. An example of this is when religious people say, I know there's a God because I believe so. Another example from Winston Wu would be, quote, just because something is irrational to skeptics doesn't mean that it's irrational to others who know or believe that it's real, unquote. Sorry, but the fact that they believe something is real does not in and of itself make that belief rational. Why do they believe it? That's what determines whether it's rational or not. Not that they believe it, but why. Until next time, stay logical.